I'd like to talk about your own feelings of being vocal when other people decide to be silent, of lecturing about a subject that has impacted all of us, but it's not a subject that makes us feel good. It makes us feel broken. About doing something which is profound. Yesterday on MTV, I did an episode with the owners of Aaliya's. One of them is from Ireland. She lives here. 2 nights ago, I spoke to Fadi Boukaram, a linguist of sorts, a storyteller. He's a Lebanese who's living in Dublin by choice. You're here, and I think largely by choice.
Yeah.
You could be in Ireland. Actually, maybe you should be in Ireland, but you're here.
That's a rational decision to make.
Right. So this irrational decision that I share with you, let's go there before we talk about rational decisions in economics. What keeps you here at this moment when there's advice to leave from all corners?
Okay, that's a very difficult question to answer, actually. For starters, I'm not well known for making the smartest decisions in life. So, jokes aside, in relative terms, compared to where I was and what I was doing when I was in Ireland or elsewhere, there is, despite the doom and gloom going on here, and quite rightfully so, there's still a much bigger sense of purpose to me being here. And that's from a purely selfish perspective. I'm under no illusion that me being here is in any way impactful. But from a purely personal viewpoint, I feel that me being here makes more sense as compared to being in Ireland or anywhere else. I feel that I'm a bit more relevant, I guess. I'm doing something more relevant. And it's precisely because we're in this sort of... now, people talk about the post-crisis Lebanon, but we're still in the middle of a crisis. So it's precisely because we're in the middle of a crisis, and a financial crisis for that matter, that me, finance professor, a teacher, a researcher, being here makes more sense to me. Makes a lot of sense to me.
You're hinting at meaning, that you feel more meaningful here than elsewhere. I'd like to touch on this a bit before we get into the heavier subjects. And this is actually a quite heavy subject on its own. I feel the exact same way. Now, I'm going to guess you work in a career that maybe you've digested it to the point that your advice is not heard enough, or at least that you're aware of your own limitations here.
Absolutely.
And this comes with the territory that you could be advocating something with full acknowledgement that little to no serious considerations are taken.
Absolutely.
Yet it's more meaningful here.
Yeah.
So this issue of finding purpose in a place that doesn't listen
reciprocate,
to it, doesn't reciprocate it. Yeah. What is the, if I could ask you that kind of question, why do you choose a place that doesn't reciprocate?
Why do I choose a place that doesn't reciprocate? Because it's not static in the sense that just because it doesn't reciprocate right now, bearing in mind that I'm a nobody.
You're not a nobody, no.
Yeah. No, I'm comfortable with that. There's nothing wrong with it.
I'll remove this from the episode. You should be the head of Muwatinu Muwatinat bid-Dawla. You're not a nobody. No, on the contrary, I think you'd be a sensible political figure had you wanted to be one. That's going to be out, don't you? Or I can keep it in if you guys want it. That's up to you. Yeah.
But the thing is that now, it really depends on whether or not you're assuming that things are going to stay that way forever. I'm under no illusion that things are going to change for the foreseeable future. That's for sure. That being said, because it's such an unpredictable country, because things dramatically change in such a short period of time when you least expect it, then you just have to anticipate it and hold still until that appropriate moment happens where perhaps you can make some impact, however little or trivial that impact is.
So it's really windows of opportunity that come and go.
Yes. And they're relatively small windows in all honesty, and they can be quite rare windows. But, we try to make the best of it.
So I'm going to segue into that subject a little later because I live in that space too. And I think that's the reason why I do the same thing. I look for those opportunities, even if they take years and years to come.
Yeah.
So we'll get to that later, and we'll obviously talk about economics and finance in that domain.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, though, about what's happening in the region and how you see it impacting Lebanon, at least on a financial economic level. We don't have to talk about politics if you don't want to on this subject, but I think they're naturally tied into each other anyway.
Yes, of course.
There is a word that came to me when I was studying. I did my master's degree some 20 years ago. And funny enough, one of the research papers was on what's happening right now, albeit 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So that kind of, and the word was de-development. I remember that. It stuck with me. The de-development of the Gaza Strip. If there's any parallel happening, do you sense that Lebanon is going through the de-development of our own economy too?
Absolutely. And Lebanon has been going through that de-development. Now, it has been going through that for even before the crisis showed its ugly face. It has been a slow and steady process that was going on since the 90s at the very least, of this sort of very slow decay, whereby the country is not really realizing the potential that it can realize, but it really exposed its very ugly face and accelerated from 2019 onwards, where you're seeing very overt signs of I'm not only talking here about the financial and economic collapse, but also the institutional decay, and even the decay of the very basic infrastructure in the country. I mean, you could point your finger at any random thing in the country and you could say, well, that's not working.
Right.
Yeah. So it's very rare that you could point your finger at something and say, okay, that's still somewhat functioning. It's quite rare. I mean, even the crown jewels that we used to take a lot of pride in, which is education, healthcare, certain services, even those are decaying right now, even though these were the only things that pre-crisis we could be somewhat not proud of, because still nowhere close to where they could have been, but at least content with, that they're not something to be at least ashamed of. But right now what we're seeing is complete decay, further exacerbated by the tragedy that is going on in Gaza. And one would have to be delusional to think that under any circumstance, however favorable the politics are in Lebanon, that what's happening in Gaza would not spill over to Lebanon negatively. Now, let's go back to reality. Where do we live in right now? We live in a post-crisis economy where people were under the illusion, and following the crisis in the last year or so, you could hear people many people were celebrating this false sense of stability, that the economy is somewhat stabilized and normalized, that things are somewhat back to normal.
Superficial things like the tourism sector.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Pre-crisis, you had these three pillars, which were tourism, banks, and remittances.
Yeah.
Right now, banks are no longer there. You're left with tourism and remittances.
Right.
But even those are being tested right now, particularly on the tourism front. So the tragedy in Gaza and the way it spilled over to Lebanon and continues to spill over to Lebanon is challenging that very foundation of this post-collapse pseudo-economy, I would say, because even calling it an economy is too dignified. This economy was characterized by betting on, first of all, it's seasonal in nature. You're depending on tourism to a large extent, and therefore these are seasonal inflows that are very heavily vulnerable to the geopolitical environment that we are in. And that actually brings us to a broader question as to what kind of economy Lebanon needs, considering the context that it operates in. And ideally, the kind of economy that you want is one that depends on sectors that are not heavily vulnerable to geopolitics, which is the exact opposite of what Lebanon was since the 1990s, because banks and financial services in general are very heavily sensitive to geopolitics. They're, in fact, having a financial sector, let's say, or a financial oriented economy is heavily contingent on having favorable geopolitics, which, whether we like it or not, we never had, and we will not have for the foreseeable future. Also, when it comes to tourism, it's heavily contingent on having a geopolitical environment that at least gives some sense of physical stability, physical safety, which clearly right now is being challenged.
Yeah.
So the tragedy in Gaza is actually challenging this notion that Lebanon's economy has stabilized, and it's actually exposing the extent to which this post-collapse economy is vulnerable.
Listening to you over now years of getting to know you, it's like a masterclass in Lebanese collapse.
Yeah.
But you're very articulate in explaining how you see what could be almost an impossible scenario, which is a relatively calm Lebanon with a relatively reformed economy, given the immense geopolitical weight on a good day.
Yeah.
So that kind of stagnation, or maybe the word paralysis is used too much in political issues, but I think it does have its tentacles in economics too, that the economy at best is paralyzed.
Oh, it certainly is paralyzed.
Right.
It was basically on life support after the collapse.
Yeah.
And it was only a matter of time after which it would implode. Now, if you asked me that question prior to what's going on in Gaza, I would have told you that perhaps this status quo of economic stagnation that is heavily dependent on tourism and tourism, or in quote-unquote tourism, because it's mostly actually
Lebanese
diaspora visiting their families and remittances, could have persisted for several years, if not more.
Had there been no regional...
Exactly. But right now, and as tragic as it is, it's laying bare the extent to which this economy, which could have survived, again, on life support for several years, how vulnerable it is, basically. It cannot survive for long. Because let's be very clear, even if suddenly the war on Gaza stops, we are still vulnerable to any potential geopolitical shock that might happen. And we know this region well enough to know that it's going to happen more frequently than we want it to.
Yeah.
And thus, I would revise my initial thesis that the status quo could survive for several years. And honestly, that was my initial thesis. We could survive for several years that way. And survive here, I'm being very generous to call it survival. I would reconsider this thesis and actually say that actually we cannot, the status quo can no longer survive, considering how vulnerable it is to the geopolitical realities.
So let's say... I mean, maybe this is more...
Which is not necessarily a bad thing, by the way. As painful as it is, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because the status quo is a horrible status quo.
Yeah. Well said. So let's say the status quo is untenable regardless.
Yes.
And it's been proven to be untenable, and we know the result.
As we speak.
Exactly. So that kind of... I'm going to try to compare Lebanon, and I don't know how valuable this is in terms of a serious article for publication. It may be more anecdotal, but I'd like to at least touch the surface here. An inability to shield anything from that problem, whether it's politics, economics, day-to-day life, the shielding is not there. So everything is exposed to that kind of endless problem. Mm-hmm. Do you think of Lebanon as moving in a direction that could be familiar to other countries? I'll give you an example. Somalia. Now, Somalia, from what I understand, limited knowledge, there are geographic areas, they're not called cantons there, but they function like cantons, that to me, at a glance, look like Batroun. They're quote unquote functioning.
Yeah.
Whatever that means to Somalia, I think it probably means to Batroun right now. And then you have a capital city that is completely unrecognizable, Mogadishu, a failed state on the national level. But then you have these semi-functional, semi-autonomous
Somaliland,
regions.
yeah.
Exactly. Somaliland, Puntland, which if you go on Google Images, it's quite startling. It's not what you think of when you think of Somalia. And it really looks like Kfar Abida, Jamal, and the places we know. So is that a scenario that could be happening right now? We're going to a failed state, for Somalia's case, over 3 decades.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about, let's start off with pre-Gaza and then we move to post-Gaza.
Sure.
Okay. You already had something that resembles that post-collapse already in place, because the way I would think of Lebanon's post-collapse economy as two totally different economies. There's an economy that seems to be thriving. Again, I'm being very generous by saying that it's thriving, functioning somewhat, which is for the perhaps 15-20% of the population that can afford it, plus the diaspora, plus the very few tourists. If you look at, if you could somewhat sort of separate the two between this bubble of the 15-20% that can afford living in Lebanon, and therefore you're talking here about the restaurants, the hotels, whatever recreational activities. If you look at that separately and you look at the rest of the country, which is the majority, the overwhelming majority actually, you could see two totally contradicting images.
Mm-hmm.
One image that seems to be doing reasonably well, quote unquote, and another that no one is seeing, that has little to no visibility, that is living in destitution and poverty. And what makes it more tragic is that there's no visibility about it. I mean, compare and contrast Badaro, Mar Mikhail, Batroun with Trablus.
Yeah.
There is no room for comparison. You wouldn't think that these are both in the same country.
It's
for that matter.
Foreigners prefer Trablus, and نحن we go to Batroun.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. So it was already there in one way or the other post-collapse. You could somewhat, separate between the two and think about two different economies within the same country.
Yeah.
Post-Gaza, you have different scenarios. Let us say we are in a scenario where you have the current level of skirmishes that are going on the borders, and let's say they persist for several months and they become the new normal, because knowing how good we are at normalizing things, assuming that these skirmishes last for long enough and don't escalate, then this will become a new normal. Yeah. So then we move to a scenario that I think is very similar to 1990s Lebanon.
I was going to say this.
Where you had post-Civil War Lebanon, anything other than the South was somewhat functioning. And then the South was a totally different story altogether. There was occupation. There were military skirmishes quite frequently. But for some reason, you had this analogy of Hanoi and Hong Kong, which Walid Jumblat mentioned several years ago, where basically the South was Hanoi and the rest of the country was Hong Kong, even though Hong Kong is too generous a comparison. So you could see Lebanon then moving in that direction as people start normalizing this new normal of skirmishes along the borders that remain contained.
The new normal,
yes,
which I completely agree with your analogy for the 1990s.
Yeah.
It really feels like the 1990s again.
Yeah.
3 decades removed.
Even though it did not sink in yet.
Right.
Yeah. And once it starts sinking in, let's take Lebanon's post-collapse economy, post-collapse pre-Gaza economy as a benchmark. Okay? Assuming that...
So really 2019 until 2 weeks ago.
Yes. Okay. Actually, not even 2019, the last year, where things started to somewhat falsely stabilize or superficially stabilize.
Yeah.
Let's take that as a benchmark for a minute. right now we're diverging from that benchmark because part and parcel of this benchmark is having some form of tourism in place. Clearly, the most likely scenario is that you're not going to have any form of serious tourism during Christmas and New Year right now. But in the medium to long term, as the status quo of contained skirmishes sinks in, assuming they remain contained, you will converge back to this status quo of false stability. It won't be as good as that. It will be somewhere worse than it, but it would stabilize as something lower than it. So that is one scenario. That is the best case scenario, assuming that the war on Gaza persists. Now, let's go to the second scenario, which is things escalate further.
In Gaza, and then implications.
Yes, and it spills over further in Lebanon.
Yes.
And actually, we might also have something close to post-Civil War Lebanon, pre-2000 Lebanon, depending on the extent to which the escalation happens. So let's say you have, God forbid, 100 times a 2006-like scenario.
Or even a 1996 one.
Yes,
where it does have long-term implications. Yeah.
You will still have some form of convergence.
Yeah.
But again, worse.
Yeah.
Much worse than the previous two scenarios. But it will take more time for it to sink in. Because something as drastic as that will take time for people to normalize.
So this is a silly question. I come as an amateur to this subject.
No, not at all.
Is there any capability, or at least are there any tools right now available to shield what's left without the worst case scenario, which is taken seriously?
Yeah.
Are there any, I mean, in a way, those three sectors that we outlined, maybe with the exception of remittances.
Remittances will stay fixed.
That even during the 1980s was...
Yes, it will stay there. Tourism, and here not tourism, we'll start talking more about, diaspora visiting their families.
Right.
You might see a pause of that, a pause in such activity for several months, for a year, for two, whatever. But as this reality sinks in, and as people recognize what are the no-go areas, the conflict areas, and the non-conflict areas, as painful as it is to say it, because this is a single country, or supposed to be such, people will start, diaspora will start visiting those safer places. It will take time for people to recognize what are the conflict areas and the non-conflict areas.
Does that, in effect, point to Somalia then? Where you have, because it seems like Somalia is there now.
Close enough, but not there yet. Where do we get there yet? Where escalation takes an extremely ugly turn, where you have an all-out war, let's say, an all-out military war. Then, in light of the political polarization in the country, huge political polarization, you might see forms of de facto cantons taking place. Now, in a scenario where you have a functioning state faced with an all-out war, then you would have what's called a war economy. The state would you would have an economy that's more sort of controlled by the state, that is more directed by the state towards, for the purposes of financing or coping with war. You don't have that.
Was Lebanon ever in that scenario, even during the war? Was there a war?
No, you didn't really. You had the de facto forms of localized war economies.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and that is what you might have then, in the absence of a central state that basically aids the country in transitioning from a normal economy to a war economy. Yeah, you will have local economies taking shape. That all of them will be war economies, no matter what one might think. You might say, well, actually, the real war economy would be in south of Lebanon, in Dahiya, and whatever.
Yeah.
But even the rest of the country, let's assume that you will have localized economies there, which is a serious possibility because given the level of political polarization, you're already hearing this toxic discourse of people saying, we have nothing to do with this war. We should have nothing to, as in like we being the subset of the country. Should have nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
If the South gets into war, it's none of our business. Or South finds itself into a war, let's say, it's none of our business. And therefore that would lead to these localized economies. But even those localized economies will be war economies because they will be forced into coping with the knock-on effects of the war. Because there will be
knock-on beyond their control anyway.
Exactly. Things like migration from conflict zones to non-conflict zones, amongst many things. So you will have basically a scenario of de facto localized war economies. Some might be more oriented towards more economies than others, but all of them will be war economies, albeit in different degrees.
In that scenario, then, you could see unusual things like certain sectors improving in local areas only.
I'm not sure if improving. I think surviving rather than improving. Surviving rather than improving. And barely surviving for that matter. You will have what's called zombie sectors that are just there but are not really functioning. This is where we get more into this Somalia territory, where you have these de facto. It might start off as merely local economies, but then it will converge to local security apparatuses, sub-state security apparatuses, and that will eventually converge to cantons. So really the implications of an all-out war, in my view, are profound and extend beyond merely physical destruction to total breakdown of the country.
Let's assume that that's the worst case scenario, and it may not be the most likely scenario.
I still think it's one of the less likely scenarios.
I share that sentiment too. The best case scenario is bad.
The best case scenario, assuming that the war in Gaza remains. Again, this is conditional on that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, this is more trying to forecast, if you will. How does the economy survive under that kind of scenario? Is it just what we've experienced up until 2 weeks ago, albeit more crippling? Is it really just the status quo that lingers until it...
Yeah.
I mean, in other words, October 7 becomes the new norm. The South is the way you described it.
Yeah.
It goes back to the 1990s scenario.
Yeah.
And then we're still in this mess. So what does it look like? Is it October 6 out just worse?
Okay. Yes, worse. But before you even get there, bear in mind that it will take a while for this new normal to sink in. Yeah. And therefore, the way I'm seeing it is, and again, this is merely educated guesses. Yeah. I totally stand corrected. I might be proven wrong, and I hope to be proven wrong for the better.
Sure. And then you'll go on Twitter and apologize for it.
I could see a scenario where, you have we have a paralysis right now. Yeah. Complete paralysis in these sort of pillars in the economy. Basically, in particular, the tourism aspect, you'll have complete paralysis there.
Yeah.
Therefore, lower foreign currency inflows, therefore more pressure on the exchange rate. So you might then find a further devaluation in the exchange rate towards some other new normal.
With places shutting down that depend on that kind of sector.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Not all of them will shut down, but many of them will shut down.
Yeah.
Until this new reality sinks in, people start recognizing, okay, these areas are safe, and therefore we could flock there. We could visit these places. We could see our families there. Our families might move there and live there. And then you will start seeing activity picking up within these regions. But again, it's just, we're talking here about a stagnation, a level of economic stagnation within a narrower geographic region this time, because it was there across the board in the country. Now you will have it only in the non-conflict areas.
Right.
So eventually it would converge back to this business as usual and over the last year. Not as good, somewhat worse, but it will take time. And how long it will take is proportionate to how contained these skirmishes are at the border.
You're a very eloquent explainer of complicated issues like this. I appreciate what you're doing. I'm learning actually from you right now. I'll try to segue back to this subject a bit later, but before I want to get into our own shared experiences of what leads up to this scenario and what maybe brings us to more exposure individually, which was October 17. I can assume that all the things that we talked about in the last 4 or 5 years are not going to happen. I'll give you 3 chief examples. The IMF deal, I can't see that happening in my lifetime. Maybe it will, I doubt it.
I share that sentiment.
Okay, so I'd like to go into that. The port blast investigation everyone talked about, I think we can safely put that to rest. There's no port blast investigation. These are 2 huge things. And the third one, which is a more controversial one, and we can go at it if you want, what exactly the anti-establishment group and all of its flavors, from the change MPs to the anti-change opposition MPs to the anti-establishment individuals, I think they're not carrying the weight. In other words, their footprint is very small.
If any.
If any. Okay. So shit, we agree on everything. Well, let's go through them one by one.
Yeah.
Do you see things that way in your own narrative and trying to explain what you know best? Do you think of it in the same way that it's a permanent decline? That all that stuff we talked about 5 years ago is simply not on the table. And all the advocacy was never taken seriously.
But just to clarify, by permanent decline, in what sense you mean a decline?
Somalia may be the best case scenario.
Okay. Yeah.
Gaza, which is impossible to imagine in Lebanon, but I could see the road towards that scenario here too.
I disagree with the permanency of it. Is it long term? Yes, it certainly is, and one would be delusional to think otherwise. This sort of decline or stagnation, if we want to be generous, is a long-term one. And accepting this horizon means that any political action or any political activism should be based on this horizon, taking that reality into account, that, okay, the status quo of stagnation is a long-term one. We're in this for the long haul. That's not a call for giving up, but that's a call for saying, well, basically the nature of the political activism is of a more long-term nature rather than an immediate one. Unless, of course, we were talking about windows of opportunity. Right. Unless a window of opportunity shows up, and that is one which you need to prepare for. So really much of the work would be on 2 fronts. One, working more at a gradualist level. I would think of it more at a sectoral level. Yeah. Sectoral in the sense that syndicates, for example, enabling worker syndicates, be it assuming that they are there, or maybe enabling the establishment of worker syndicates where they are not there, to basically force a new reality, a new economic reality for themselves. So here, the language that you would want to use with them is one that is related to their own economic interests.
Right.
So that is one. But on the other hand, you should be preparing for that opportunity that may come at any point in time.
Which goes back to the reason you are here.
Yes.
So preparing for, I don't know if it's the right analogy, the black swan.
It is a black swan event to a large extent.
Okay, so preparing for the unexpected opportunity which could happen 10 years from now or a year from now.
Yeah.
But anticipating for the most part that this is a generational story.
Absolutely.
So I guess in retrospect now, looking back at October 17 and the moment that came and went, do you think of that as an epic disappointment? Was that an opportunity that you saw seriously? Because
yes.
So that
it was an epic failure. Yes. Yeah. It was an epic failure. And this is not, I'm not trying to self-flagellate here. This is really just looking at it and critiquing it so that we don't fall into these very same traps once another window of opportunity shows up. And I'm quite confident that we will live to see the day where a window of opportunity shows up that we should exploit. Why the more important question is, why was it an epic failure?
Yeah.
At least in my view, it was an epic failure because the emphasis was on what we were against. So we were against the political class, but not really what we were for. So what kind of Lebanon we want? And the question of what kind of Lebanon we want, the answer to it requires having a political program, a political agenda, and being shameless that, you want to basically influence the country. And the only way you want to influence the direction of the country is by ruling. So most opposition groups shied away from this, shied away from saying, okay, this is what we want. This is how we see Lebanon. This is how we want Lebanon to be. And the only way where you could get there is by getting to power. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong, and it's perfectly normal that during certain periods of time, groups that are poles apart might episodically find themselves together in the same front for a certain period of time.
Yeah.
But to get to the point where you could forge an alliance with another group, you need to be clear on what you agree on, and more importantly, what you disagree on, and whether you could live with these disagreements or not.
Right.
Yeah. Alliances don't happen, and they only happen between groups that disagree. Yeah. Otherwise, if they agree on everything, there's no point of an alliance.
Maybe one group. Yeah.
But the problem is that opposition groups didn't seem to know what they disagreed on and what they agreed on to forge meaningful alliances.
If I could use that as a template, which you laid out, and then go back to the last 4 years, let's assume things went in that direction. There's a political platform. There's serious acknowledgement of disagreements.
Yeah.
There's constructive alliances on strategic goals. And this could be a few. It doesn't have to be a daily occurrence.
Yeah.
Let's say
or even tactical goals.
Tactical goals.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it could be, I'm sorry to use this word, but transactional.
Yeah.
It could be literally like...
We don't want to be... in politics, you cannot be a purist.
Right. Yeah.
You cannot be a purist in politics.
And there are plenty of purists in politics.
Or who would like to think of themselves as purists.
Well said. Let's say things moved in that... Let's say that template was applied.
Yeah.
And that window of opportunity, what you see as necessary, took shape. Is there anything to the... Not necessarily it's a counter argument, it's more trying to insert what's happening right now with Gaza and that kind of scenario in Lebanon. Are we, through that kind of platform, better shielded from things that are essential to the economy anyway?
Given the current status quo?
Yes.
No.
Okay.
No. We're in a totally different reality right now. Yeah. I think, what we should be bracing ourselves for is what kind of economy can cope with a reality that is exogenous to us, that we have little to no control over.
Would a shared platform be better at making that a reality?
Well, that shared platform will only be able to make that a reality if it's in power.
Right.
And it goes back, if the goal of an opposition is just to be in opposition, I don't want it, to be honest. So I want an opposition that clearly says, I am in here to get to power, and this is what I will do from day one X, A, B, C, D, E, whatever.
Yeah.
That's not the case so far.
So let's go with that power
Yeah.
analogy. And it's the way it is right now that the crowd in power is the crowd we know.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think of you've been summoned to explain what's going on. And you're the person sought to advise policy right now. What would you recommend given how bad things are? And how would you sell it? And I'll give you just a standard thing which we both dismissed. Let's say the IMF is serious about a deal happening. How could that possibly happen with the crowd in power right now? Is it an impossible scenario?
It's an impossible scenario.
Okay, so that door is completely closed.
Yes. Yeah.
So how is power achieved now to make what you want a reality? Is it...
It's going to take a lot of time. As I said, it goes back to, preparing for that window, working on two things in parallel. One, empowering sectors that have been crushed as a result of the collapse, empowering them to get back their rights in their own hand. But in parallel, preparing for that window of opportunity when it comes so that you could exploit it in a bid to get to power. Again, I cannot emphasize enough on this.
No, I agree. I'll be devil's advocate, though. What are the windows of opportunity now? Are they another uprising? Are they elections? Are they... You said syndicates. Is that leaning more on municipal elections if they happen? What does a window of opportunity look like? Is it security related? Is it taking advantage of a scenario where you insert yourself accordingly?
Okay, so I think one thing which one myth which the collapse put to bed is that you can bet that if things go really bad, people will rise up as a result of it. That a huge collapse will trigger people into rising up. It's quite the contrary, actually. Because the worse things get, the more people's priorities as individuals will be oriented towards surviving, personal survival. And therefore, as a result of this, politics, in the proper sense of the word, becomes a luxury that only those who can afford it engage in. So let's start off. One hypothesized window of opportunity is that things become that this current status quo of stability
stops. It becomes
anarchic.
Almost.
Yes, a bet on that I think is a failed bet. Given our personal experience with 2019-2020 collapse. I mean, it's really very difficult to speculate how that window of opportunity will look like given the current scenario, especially given the current geopolitical scenario. It is very difficult to actually visualize a window of opportunity, to be honest. And to say otherwise would be quite arrogant from my side. So quite frankly, I can't tell. I can't even think of a window of opportunity under such a scenario.
I can remove this from the episode.
No,
later.
That's perfectly fine.
No, the next part. No, that part was nice. No, let's look back at October 17 through elections.
Yeah,
May 2022. We saw certain groups doing what you talked about.
Yeah,
but their traction was limited. Traction meaning not necessarily in total votes. It could be that it didn't seem to sell on a national level. For whatever reason, it didn't become the defining alternative for power. It became a background story quickly, and it faded fast. I don't have to name them if you don't want me to.
Yes. I'm well aware who you're talking about.
Being careful here, yeah. Is anyone disguised as him in the background? No.
Nope.
No, okay. So that very carefully crafted scenario happened and went with a flicker. Although when it was happening, it felt like there's something there, and it's not there. That kind of platform with that kind of exposure didn't really stick.
Yeah.
How would it stick the next time? Does it stick more because things are worse? Or does it simply stick at the same level given that it's not appealing enough?
Yeah, I think we need to own up to our failures here. It didn't stick because these groups didn't do a good enough job in appealing to people in general. And this, and here this is my purely personal view, this extremely sort of elitist language that was being used. Let's be honest. I mean, if you want to appeal, to get to power, you need to appeal to people. You cannot appeal to people with elitist language. Not in this country, certainly.
By elitist, it could even be academic.
Yes. In hindsight, the only language that works with people is a language that they can relate to. And the only language that they can relate to is a language that talks to them from the angle of their economic interests as groups or individuals.
So it's on a very local, almost individual level.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Because that's the only way you could, that's the hook based on which you could sort of appeal to people.
You know, it's interesting. It's not the same story, but two nights ago, I did an episode with Fadi Boukaram about this subject, about communication through elitist words. And he was very upset about that kind of discourse because it turns people away. He was even talking about his own father not understanding. And he has to explain the subject to his father at least. It doesn't work. So is that a lesson learned for the next round, that it's going to be not necessarily populist, but
more down to earth?
Down to earth.
Yes.
And that would make it more sellable during the next round.
Yes. Or so I would hope, at least.
So a further question on that. Is that something that's happening in smaller circles? Is there any maybe grassroots activism that's not shared on social media?
We are starting to see some signs. They're not that overt yet. My hope is that they will start showing their face quite quickly.
Are you spearheading this initiative?
No.
No. Does that mean yes?
No.
No. Oh,
Certainly not.
Certainly not. Definite yes. No, I'm joking. I think you should. I think you, as somebody who listens to a lot of people talk, I think that kind of measure and patience, I think it is persuasive.
Thanks.
It could I think catch on when it's sold the right way. Anyway, the last section before we get to a break in Q&A. Well, it's a two layered question. The first one is kind of straightforward. When you go to AUB now and you're lecturing to the next generation, are you implying that this is something they should take from you? Are you showing them in your courses a gap that you'd like to see them fill later? So in other words, it's not politics, it's classroom.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily always appropriate there, but I'm sure people ask you similar questions in the class. At least they're searching for something like that. Are you using academia to maybe make this a little more feasible later?
Okay, so I think this speaks up more to the broader question of the role of a university in a crisis scenario. And what's perhaps the most heartbreaking thing that I have to deal with is that I am teaching a group of students who almost all of them are planning to leave the country once they finish their degrees.
Yeah.
Now,
I didn't consider that.
Yeah.
You're educating a generation that's leaving.
That's planning to leave, yes.
Yeah.
That being said, I would like to bring you back to the idea that, the current state of affairs cannot be permanent. Yeah. It can and will be long term, but there will be an inflection point. There has to be an inflection point. And since I teach finance, I can basically use that as an example. Let's be very clear. No modern economy can survive and thrive in the absence of a functional financial sector. Yeah? So that's a reality, whether we like it or not. Okay? With that in mind, once that inflection point happens, it could be the political atmosphere changes in the country, whatever. And given that you virtually have no financial sector in the country right now, some people will have to come back and basically build it from scratch. Yeah. Now, am I expecting that from my students? Certainly not. That would be expecting too much. But my hope is that a subset of them, once that window of opportunity shows up, would be spearheading or contributing to the efforts to set up a financial sector that serves the economy and serves society in the way that it should, rather than it being just the speculative vehicle that it was since the 1990s.
So it's hoping that a subset of those students remember you and
Not me, no, not remember me. That once they graduate
Yeah.
and they gain excellent experiences abroad and they go up the career ladder, that they may eventually find a politically reformed Lebanon, albeit with with barely any functioning financial sector, to be actually an opportunity for them to exploit, even if from a purely opportunistic viewpoint.
Yeah.
There's absolutely nothing inherently wrong with that.
Yeah. So they're looking for the same window of opportunity.
Yes. Even if from the perspective of personal interests.
Right. Yeah.
And therein lies the role of a state that wants to ensure that these personal interests are aligned with the broader good.
Yeah. Last question.
Yeah.
Now, when I think of AUB, for better or worse, I think about friends who lecture at AUB. Even though I went to AUB, I know the campus in and out. I grew up walking through that campus. At a later stage, I think about friends. I think about you when I think about AUB, for better or worse. I think about other people too. And this is you can say whatever you'd like. This is really just to get your emotional, it's to ask you something that, if it relates to you in any way, on an emotional level, you see people expressing themselves. And you have to there has to be a way for people to vent their anger. I don't know if we always find the right way, but there has to be a way. And I become hesitant. I become cautious. Even though I know protesters are not going to enter AUB, I know that. It would never happen. I know the limitations of that kind of scenario. But seeing protesters at least not attack AUB, but vandalize certain areas of the campus on the outside, I become reluctant. Naturally. Forget why they're protesting, forget the anger behind it. I sense that it's something that I think of as essential under attack, and I take a step back.
Okay. So, as much as I understand the reluctance, I think we need to be I don't mean you in general, us as being people who might be reluctant, be a bit more down to earth and understand why this is happening. And in the absence of organized political groups that mobilize people to protest for whatever goals, you will find these ad hoc protests that are disorganized, that will take certain forms that we may or may not like, and in many cases we may not like. And now, I'm not trying to normalize this in any way, but I think it shouldn't be surprising. That's what I mean. Given the state of affairs the country in, given the geopolitical context surrounding it, given how high emotions are, I think we need to somewhat empathize with, as difficult as it is, with those people and where they're coming from, or at least not empathize, but at least understand why this is happening. Because personally, I don't find it to be particularly surprising.
That's for sure.
It's in the context that we live in, protests going south and taking an unpleasant turn is perfectly expected. We should expect that. We shouldn't be surprised about it in any way. It's expected. And I don't think it should make us reluctant. Quite the contrary. Precisely because it's disorganized, we need to find ways through which we can organize any protest movement in a way that makes it purposeful rather than just a way to vent out.
That word is essential, disorganized. I think the organized version of it has a different level of expectation of what it could do. But even in disorganized expression, and I share the sentiment as well, you have to, the sympathy has to be there even when it's uncomfortable.
Yes.
But it teeters on thuggery sometimes. Teeters.
Yeah.
That could be vandalism, that could be people getting attacked because they're bystanders. And I know none of us really like Starbucks. But when you see that Starbucks broken into, it sends a different message. It becomes less disorganized political expression, more what seems to be an indicator of bad things to come. Or at least low-level violence that could spill in that direction more often.
Now, when it comes to low-level violence, yes, we should be anticipating low-level violence being a thing, not normalized but anticipated.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be surprised about it, and quite frankly, I wouldn't want. I don't think we should be confrontational towards them in any way, because really it feeds in more into the grievances driving them. So yeah, I'm not sure if I answered.
No, you're choosing the words that I think which are missing sometimes. That it's anticipation rather than tolerance. Or
Yeah.
And it's disorganized versus.
And
Yeah.
I mean, one would have to be quite disconnected not to have expected
Yeah.
low-level violence to take place, given how high emotions are.
Yeah. So to wrap it up, both of us use social media
Yeah.
beyond our profession. Both of us express ourselves in ways that are sometimes funny. I know that
And many times inappropriate, at
and
least for
inappropriate.
myself.
I know that you're a cat lover by accident,
Yes.
and I'm a cat lover too. So these are, that's the same page where you're expressing the most politically charged statement.
Yeah.
And they could be literally on top of each other. Which
Yes.
Is, yeah. So it makes me wonder what exactly is going on. Do you stroke your cat and get, ideas for the future of Lebanon? That evil, what's his name in Inspector Gadget? This evil guy at the end who's, yeah. I use social media too, and I do vent sometimes. There are moments where I realize I am expressing myself with electricity. Do you think, and this is going back to what's happening right now, do you think we're using our social media the right way to offer what I think is a principled statement in support of a population that's under attack, denied their freedom, denied justice, denied everything, robbed of all that should come from history in a positive way, treated in the worst case scenario right now? Are we doing the right thing? Are we reflecting the right way through social media?
Vis-a-vis Gaza, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fadi, yesterday, 2 nights ago, chooses a path of moderation and benefit of the doubt, which I thought was an unusual path. He has these 5-minute clips where he's trying to reach out to the other side, but it's almost like sedative talking. I don't know if that's better or worse. I don't know if it matters or not, really. But what we're doing, in other words, trying to punch, is that the right way?
I think it's the very least we can do. It's the very least we can do, given the limitations. So yes, it is. If we can do more, we should do more. But unfortunately, that's all we can do, and the very least we can do.
That's well said.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll leave it there. So
Perfect.
let's take a 10-minute break. I think we can turn the music back on, and we'll then have a Q&A moment. You can ask anything you want to both of us. Thanks, Mohamad.
Thanks.
Professor Faour.
لا دخيلك بلاها الكلمة.
Assistant Professor Faour.
Just محمد.
Muhammad. Thank you. تفضل محمد. Let's make this Q&A as fun as possible. I know things are bleak. I know the conversation's heavy, but most of us are friends here. I think everyone knows each other for the most part. So ask us whatever you'd like. And the audio goes into the episode. There's no video on you, so don't worry. You won't be in the episode, just your voice. Oh, shit. What, do you want to be in the video? You have to stand right here and ask us. So, any questions to start with? Hola. And just introduce yourself, who you are, what you do.
Hi, I'm Ola Kazal. I'm an interior architect. And this is what I do, basically, with other things. I actually have a question that's a bit economical. Like, we are basically good in tourism. And we witnessed a very successful summer season. And we are almost on another touristic season, which is like the Christmas season. December should be very busy. We're big in Christmas markets and concerts and all these kinds, and ski also. But what's happening now with that? Like, even if this war situation won't escalate, even if this was gonna end tomorrow, are we still expecting a successful season, or everything is getting canceled now?
Judging by the current circumstances, it's very difficult to see tourism season during Christmas and New Year. But more importantly, I think, is that even if things do sort of tomorrow stabilize, this stigma of war will still linger. So it will take a while until people start easing back into the country, given how profound the spillover of the tragedy of Gaza was to Lebanon. So I don't see, and one of the main points that I was mentioning initially was that, this shows how vulnerable Lebanon is economically, that you are so heavily dependent on a seasonal sector like tourism, amongst other things like remittances, in a region that you cannot depend on such things so heavily. Tourism will always be one of the most, if not the most important aspect of the Lebanese economy, but you cannot be overly dependent on it. You just cannot, especially in this geopolitical environment, which will never fade away. It's something that we have to live with. So yeah, I don't see a great tourism season, if that's a question.
The gentleman.
Hi.
Just who you are, please. What you do.
Naim.
What
do I do? Let's skip that. A lot of things. So, one thing I seriously don't understand is, like, I think, okay, it's lots of smart questions, but most of this is going to happen in some echo chamber. We're very familiar with how this goes, either on Twitter or something, where I'm talking to my followers, to my audience, and there's this. I don't understand this anymore. Like, we know this, we see this. Like, it feels like I'm just talking to my fingers. I'm trying to convince myself of something, some very smart idea that I'm coming up with. There's someone that looks just like me. How about I sit down and talk to his fingers? It's, but like basic, like, it almost feels like hyper-normalism. Like, what's his name again? I forgot his name. So, am I the alien to feel like this? Yeah, because I keep bringing this up, and it's like, we even have like Brave New World drugs for it. If something slightly bothers my bubble, I can take something to, and the world can just burn outside and I'm fine. I don't get this. I just don't get it. We're supposed to just sit here and watch things. Oh, this is the news. This is what's happening. I don't get it.
I'll say something and then
Yes.
Yes. I guess it's for both of us, right? Yeah. Okay. By the way, I know what you do now. You sketch. Show me the back of that. That's pretty good. Oh, it's your. Oh. Okay. Well, she's talented. The question you asked is something that I've been thinking of for 6 years now, longer. I mean, this podcast is exactly, you threw the whole thing under the bus the right way. Narrative, I think, is the only tool people have right now in trying to shape something. Mohamad and I have talked several times. We've talked about different issues. We've even talked once, and it was one of my most interesting discussions. It's yourself with a federalist. And we're all talking about the moment we're going through, but we were all very calm with each other and patient. It's a long time ago, but that's about narrative. It's trying to find mutual understanding, trying to find problems, identify them, rethink how Lebanon got here. There are many disagreements on the way. Even within this conversation, if Mohamad and I really talked about it for hours on end, we'd reach points of disagreement. But I think the narrative war, if that's how it's called, is one of the few tools left for people in this country when talking. But politics, I agree with you. There isn't much. Mohamad was right. Power is essential, and I think power has been denied for this type of person for a very long time.
It's a YouTube episode. It's going to be a YouTube episode.
It's on audio, YouTube, everywhere. Yeah.
We used to have more. We used to have more open channels for discussion that mean something, like old Reddit, for example, or forums. If I don't know, like just 10 years ago, the internet was something where you have diverse opinions, and now even Reddit is not Reddit anymore, and there's no, like, comments don't do anything on YouTube or any of the platforms. That's what I'm talking about. You two can have a brilliant discussion, but that's as far as it's going to go. It is like anyone who has some comment on something is just going to be buried in a pile. And we know other alternatives for that foster like proper discussion, and we know how to do that. We just don't do that because we're comfortable in our own eco bubbles, me included. I'm all of us. This is how it's gone now. That's my point.
I think one thing which the collapse gave rise to is lots of mini bubbles that people formed around themselves as a coping mechanism. And there's absolutely nothing wrong, and allow me to say that yes, this is one of those bubbles. There's no insult in saying that. I have my own bubble too, and that's a form of a coping mechanism, because that's the only way really I could cope with what's going on around me. So the country right now, particularly, it was always the case, but more so post-crisis, is a collection of different bubbles, different echo chambers, and we need to content with this reality. We need to be content with that reality. So if what you mean is that this is a bubble, yeah, perhaps. And I don't think a bubble is in and of itself an insult. Where does a bubble becomes an issue is that, let's say you are working in politics. If your political activism is within that echo chamber, then that is a problem. But beyond political activism, I don't see anything inherently wrong with bubbles, especially in the context that we live in.
We're talking about problems that we want. If we're talking about problems that we want to resolve, you want to do something where, okay, if we're having a disagreement on something, if we have the chance to put it down on paper and we can reach or at least have a face-to-face talk, we can reach. But if we're just happy to be I understand not everything has to be a discussion and all of this, but at least for the things that we're trying to move forward, I don't understand how we can do that without addressing the bubble first. Like, we complain about all of this, and then we go and just use Twitter and WhatsApp. Like, the very basic settings of what it is you're using don't allow you to move anything forward.
I think it's being a little too hard. I think narrative is still something that's valuable, and shaping opinion when those windows of opportunity emerge, I think there's something there, but it's a limited tool. But I think the alternative in this climate would be one of two things. Mohamad and I start shooting people, which I don't think either one of us can do.
Yeah. And we wouldn't be doing a good job at it anyways.
We wouldn't be doing, yeah. So we would we would end that very quickly. I think which, yeah, well, that's even worse. Yeah. So taking security measures into our own hands, which is, I think, the false power neither one of us searches for. The other one, I think you're alluding to, which is a paralyzed politics in Lebanon that goes beyond discussions. I mean, I don't know how big the bubble is. I've had disagreements. I don't know if this is the first episode. Maybe you've listened. Yeah, so I've had some episodes that it's night and day with the other person, but they could still be in that bubble. It could still, yeah.
There should be some environment to induce more of that, because this is where, you didn't shoot each other. Apparently you're still here. You had that discussion, so it must have done something. But like you said, we're all here friends. Who are we talking? Like, I'm trying to imagine a place where we're talking to someone across the aisle somehow.
What's that name? That should be in Parliament, not in Aaliya's. I mean, that is a political process, not to people that are better at talking and yeah.
I don't have so much hope of things changing because
yeah. Other questions? I know, Samir, you have one, but just anyone? No? Okay, Samir, please.
Yeah, okay. Just to chime in a little bit on this, the issue of narrative as well. I mean, I kind of feel with that question, especially when you're talking about the internet and how it was 10 years ago. I remember it back in the 90s as well. It was really more free with IRC and a lot of forums popping up and then. But yeah, I do feel we've kind of lost something. But again, with the issue with narrative and what we're doing, podcasts or keep talking about all these issues, is that we're just leaving markers for historians later on to, we tend to see our life from the perspective of our lifetime, and history and evolution doesn't work that way. It works on much grander scales, in my opinion. So it's just the period we're in, I guess. But the question I do want to ask is, okay, so 2008, 2009, major banking collapse across the world. Lebanon was we're very fine here, look at us. And, then 2019 happens. I think that was all in the waiting.
Imploded.
Yeah, you said something very interesting. I thought that, we need a good financial sector, and the banking system is part of the financial sector, and they're mostly corrupt because they're in bed with the politicians or partially owned by the politicians, or that. So this is a reduction of a much bigger question I had from other things, but yeah. So let's say we did have a good standing government, and this, or people like you or the change movement step into power, gain power, and it's time to do something. So how, as a measure, how would you find nationalizing all the banks?
Okay, yeah. Okay, so now I don't have a dogma against nationalization, to be very clear, because even on the economic side, people tend to place me on the left of the spectrum when it comes to economics. But it's important to look at the context of Lebanon and how bank nationalization would what would it lead to? When you're nationalizing banks that are so much deep in the red, they're very deep in the red, and they're deep in the red towards depositors. So there are 80 billion dollars worth of losses. So when you nationalize a bank or the banking sector, you're also inheriting these losses as the state, and by extension as the taxpayer. So I would rather not want to inherit this mess as a taxpayer, the mess of these huge losses. So nationalization or temporary nationalization of banks is one of many tools that one can use. But in the Lebanese context, you will basically have to nationalize the whole sector. Yeah. But you'll also have to take ownership of the losses as a taxpayer. And as a taxpayer, quite frankly, I don't want to take ownership of these losses. That's something that has to be ring-fenced within the current banking sector and addressed without making the taxpayer shell out the bill. So in the context of Lebanon, I mean, there's no point of nationalizing. The whole banking sector is bankrupt. Let's acknowledge that reality and start from a clean slate. I'm being quite simplistic in this, but really what I mean to say is that it's nationalizing the Lebanese banking sector, given its situation, is a horrible idea because you're offloading the losses of the banking sector onto the taxpayer.
Could I extend that? Other than forced closures of banks in Lebanon that have happened, has there ever been that scenario?
Not in Lebanon. There's a scenario which is Iceland, which I use as a role model in one way or the other onto how to deal with a fully bankrupt banking sector. What Iceland did is that they acknowledged during the 2008-2009 crisis, the whole banking sector was bankrupt. They acknowledged that. They basically let their banks fail. And they've put the banks under temporary state administration until they were back on their feet again. However, the challenge here is that in the Icelandic case, the bank's main creditor or the depositors who took the hit were foreign depositors. They were Dutch depositors, they were British depositors, and they took the hit. In Lebanon, the depositors are primarily Lebanese. So, well, yes, that's also, yes, of course, yeah. But in general, they're local, even though I would hope that a majority of them are ones who wouldn't feel sorry about if they have to take the hit. So it's. I mean, when it comes to the banking sector, you're not really talking about restructuring a banking sector. You're talking about acknowledging the fact that it's gone, and let's see what we could do right now. So basically, rebuilding a new banking sector from scratch. Not to nationalize something, it has to exist, and as far as I'm concerned, it just doesn't exist. There's no financial sector.
Those existing banks who did everything to obstruct the IMF plan, whatever other salvage plans, what's their end game? Like, what do they hope for? What's the best case scenario for them?
For them, if I was a banker, a Lebanese banker, I would like the status quo to stay as is. That my bank as an entity remains intact, even though it's just there. It's an empty shell, yes. But if I was a banker, that was the most I would hope for. The most I would hope for. However, let's zoom out a little bit and think about what is for the public good. Let us say in this magical scenario where you could address the losses of the banking sector head on, okay? So Bank Aaliya no longer has losses, Blom Bank no longer has losses. Magically, these losses disappear, okay? And put yourself in a depositor's shoes. I mean, most of you would be depositors, or many of you would be depositors. Even if these losses are magically addressed, would you want to put a single penny in a bank that still has the same management that led to where it led to? Absolutely not. At least that's my view. Public trust in the banking sector in its current form has been shut down beyond repair. It's irredeemable. The only way I could think of a banking sector that the public trusts somewhat, and I would hope that it trusts with a healthy dose of skepticism, is a totally different banking sector with totally different management, totally different board of directors, rebranded also because perception also matters. If you're just going to maintain Bank Audi, even though it's the same management, I'm using that as an example merely, people will say, oh, that's still Bank Audi. So perception also matters. So you want a totally new banking sector, which is easier said than done, with totally new management. And even under that scenario, it will take the public perhaps a generation to regain trust in banks as institutions.
The long-term scenario that happened in the 1980s, which fed into the 90s, where inflation rose and things were not stable in terms of building trust in the banking sector. What did it look like back then? Was it the same banks just trying to lure back lost customers that had taken their money elsewhere?
Frankly, I didn't look into this. I should look into this.
It'd be interesting to see if they...
Yeah, that's more of a historic... It would be interesting to look into that.
Or did a lot of money simply stay where it was? Post-hyperinflation? And,
perhaps yes.
Yeah.
Perhaps yes. Yeah. And let's be clear, the banking sector during the Civil War ironically was in much better shape than it is right now.
There was still access to something.
You could still access your money.
Yeah, even though it went from 2 lira to 3,000.
Yes, now if you had money in Lebanese lira, that got wiped out.
Right,
Yes.
yeah. Did you have a question? No? Do you want to ask something? Follow up? Sure.
I have another but very trivial question. And it's regarding the exchange rate, dollar to the lira. And this Bloomberg platform that they announced.
Sorry, there's a lot of background noise, so I'm struggling.
No, I'm saying the exchange rate.
Yes.
That has been like so stable for so long.
Yeah.
And with supposedly the fact that the Sayrafa platform disappeared was supposed to be replaced by Bloomberg. Yeah. How do you explain the stability and how do you see the coming period, especially considering the geopolitical situation?
It's a combination of relatively large inflows of foreign currency during a good tourism season, but also central bank intervention, what's called quasi-fiscal intervention, through Sayrafa, where they, in convoluted ways, pay public sector salaries in US dollars, and somewhat that helps in maintaining the stability of the currency. But how do I see it going forward? I think the juncture that we are in is a major test of this false sense of stability. Because a big part of the reason why the lira was somewhat stable was because of this tourism season that we had during the summer. Right now, under a scenario where you're deprived of a good tourism season during Christmas, that's a major test for the stability of the Lebanese lira. There will be pressure on it, needless to say. Will that pressure manifest through further devaluation? Perhaps. I'm in no position to speculate. I don't think it's a good idea to speculate about the direction of the currency. But clear, in my view, the status quo of this somewhat seemingly stable currency is not sustainable. And it's being put to test right now. And only time will tell how sustainable this is. I mean, I would be surprised. I mean, Sayrafa, Bloomberg, these are minor details. I'm talking more about sort of the macro picture. Replacing Sayrafa with Bloomberg, I mean, it's just a replace. As of now, the way I'm seeing it is just you're changing the platform. But replacing Sayrafa with Bloomberg will not necessarily mean that the central bank will stop It's quasi-fiscal operations of intervening in the currency market. They haven't really dramatically changed. No, they're still more or less the same. There might have been less intervention owing to a good tourism season, so less of a need to intervene. But this is not. There's a serious test right now. Towards the end of the year, towards early next year, the stability or this sense of stability of the currency is put under test.
You were talking about Iceland, and Iceland actually was struggling before, and they used the help of IMF.
Yes.
But they knew that their strong point is tourism and nature tourism, so they invested in that, and their government made some good relationship with other countries, and they made direct flights with a lot of countries, and they made it a specific touristic destination for like hiking and nature trips. And they built like a huge building in the middle of Reykjavik, the capital, and it's mainly all for touristic use. And they have been doing great since then. And in the last 10 years, the country is the people are still struggling now economically.
Yes.
But as a country, it's developing, and it's getting like it's
one of the
getting
fastest growing in the
successful
EU,
with that.
actually. It's still one of the fastest growing economies in the EU up until now.
Just because of tourism and what they're doing. Do you think that's a great example? Since Lebanon is also relying on tourism, it's not a great example.
It's not a great example because I wish we had the geopolitical environment of Iceland, but we don't. And tourism is very heavily sensitive to geopolitics. So unless we could magically move Lebanon from where it is geographically to somewhere else, I think that a model that is heavily dependent on tourism is not viable for a country like Lebanon, given the context. No, and even if, no matter what you do internally, the geopolitics will always be exogenous to you. It's very difficult to control it. And therefore, that will always have its toll on the tourism sector. Again, I repeat, the tourism sector will still be a main sector in any economy, in any way you could visualize the Lebanese economy. It shouldn't be the only one, and you shouldn't be too dependent on it.
Lebanon, a little bit to the left, in the middle of the sea, next to Cyprus, and that will fix a lot of problems.
So
Perhaps.
just before Naeem, sorry, I'll ask one more, feeding into what Ola said. I never think of Iceland when I think of this country, but you said the geopolitical reality of Iceland, which is funny, is zero.
Yeah.
They're left alone to deal with flights flying over.
Yeah, they're minding their own business. Yeah.
Yeah, on occasion, there's Greenland gets some attention for tourism, and Iceland picks up from there and says, no, we're Greenland. That's Iceland. But that kind of absolute detached from a regional problem, when it comes back to platforms and political parties' next round and a window of opportunity, do you think that's one of the things that was not hammered down enough in the recent round, in the recent window, that we were talking maybe a bit too much about economics only? But what Ola is saying and what you were saying earlier sounds really more like politics at its widest scale. Is that something that was not really discussed enough?
Well, okay. I don't buy into this distinction between economics and politics.
Yeah.
Economics is, at the end of the day, or economic outcomes are a result of political decisions that you make.
Yeah.
Policy decisions are, in their essence, political decisions. So attempting to disentangle between economics and politics is a futile exercise.
Yeah.
I mean, even economics at its very core, when it started off, it wasn't a technical discipline. It was a social science. They were primarily social scientists, philosophers, it was more political economy oriented, and political comes before the economy part. Yeah. So this idea of disentangling between the two, it just doesn't work. Any economic policy decisions have to have in mind the political context or geopolitical context that you operate in.
Yeah.
If you're not cognizant of that, then then the wrong inputs are feeding into wrong policy decisions.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Naeem?
Just one little fact about Iceland. Women, and including the prime minister is a woman, are on strike for better gender pay.
Yes.
I don't think it worked in Iceland because, whatever, like, the thing is, the basic thing, and there was trust. Hey, these people, look, they deal with something. Oh, so basic rule of law. Okay, business comes when there's some basic logic of something. But what I'm trying to go back to here is, it seems like we're stuck here and waiting for the regional whatever. It seems like we can't. The only thing we can imagine is just moving the country somewhere else, like anything except we changing the core. Maybe we come to this when we give up of the people that are in power changing something.
To be very clear, I certainly am not advocating for waiting for geopolitics to solve themselves. Quite the contrary. But what I am saying is that the only vehicle that can play the role of playing, rather than a passive role, an active role of trying to make the country function despite the geopolitics is the state. That's the only vehicle that can do that.
Or the only vehicle that should do that.
That can and should.
Yeah,
yes.
right.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm certainly not advocating for a passive role where you're waiting for Godot, waiting for the geopolitics to sort themselves out. That is delusional, particularly given that unfavorable geopolitics are the modus operandi of Lebanon. What I am saying is, how can we make this country work despite the geopolitics? Waiting for the geopolitics to be favorable is delusional. So I'm certainly not advocating for a passive role, but rather an active role that tries to make the country work despite the geopolitics.
We have time for one more question. Now, the table of friends should ask one question about Mohamad for Mohamad. The jump. Okay, we have time for two more. You guys are going to get the last one. It could be a collective one.
Hey, my name is Tanner. I'm a political economist.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, so given the role of tourism within Lebanon's economy, my impression is more so than a lot of other countries that are reliant on tourism, Lebanon's tourism is very heavily driven by the diaspora.
Yes.
So given that fact, how elastic is tourism in Lebanon to geopolitical events? Given, like, in Jordan, for example, I talked to Jordanians. When the U.S. invaded Iraq, tourism went way down. They had a long track ahead of them to get levels back to what they had used to be. Egypt, it's the same story. Something happens in the region, tourism tanks, and it takes a long time to come back. In Lebanon, what does that look like?
Okay, it's not very different, actually. So given that tourism is very heavily driven by the diaspora, the way I would see it is that in the short to medium term, yes, you will have a and again, we spoke about those three scenarios in a post-Gaza, in a scenario where you have skirmishes going on, and them remaining contained, you will have a dip in the short term, and it will start converging back in the medium to long term. Again, under the assumption that these skirmishes remain contained within this geographic region. How long it will take is proportionate to how long it will take people for it to sink in, basically. So basically, it will take time for people to realize that, okay, these are the regions that are places in Lebanon that are safer, and therefore we can travel and go stay there. So Lebanon is not particularly different compared to Jordan, compared to Egypt. You will have a dip in the short to medium term, followed by a reversion that is proportionate to how long it will take for this new normal to normalize, basically, or to sink in.
One question from everyone at this table. Sara, please.
I'm Sarah from the group of friends.
That's your
Okay.
job. Yeah.
Yeah, cheer. Okay, so a scenario question. If you were the governor of the central bank, what would you do?
Sorry. Can you repeat?
If you were nowadays the governor of the central bank here, what would you do?
I wouldn't want to be the governor, first of all.
Yeah, I know.
We'll baptize you first.
What would I do? Well, governor in this political context? لا, it really depends. Is it in this political context of political dysfunction?
Yeah.
Maybe, yes.
لا, if it is in the context of political dysfunction, there's nothing that I can do. Because now the right thing to do as a central banker would be to stop funding any fiscal activity, okay? So basically stop financing salaries, whatever, given the scarcity of resources that I have. I'm talking here purely from a central bank's perspective, not from a political or a political economy perspective. However, if I do that, given the current context, all the fingers will be pointed at me because it will be a very painful decision. Suddenly, public sector pay will collapse. Public sector employees will literally be starving for a while, assuming that the salary is the only source of income. And I will be on the receiving end of the blame, even though the main blame falls on the political dysfunctionality in the country. So is there something that can be done in a context of political dysfunctioning? Absolutely not. It has to be part and parcel of a broader sort of political economy viewpoint with regards to how the political institutions will look like, how the political system will look like. Any policy decisions that you cannot think of any policy decision in isolation of this reality.
So a new governor has nothing to their advantage.
Absolutely nothing. You could get the best central banker to ever exist, and they will fail miserably in the in Lebanon's local political context.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about the geopolitical context.
Yeah. Okay. Are there any other questions before we wrap up? No? Did you have one? No? See, I was kind of hoping for an obscure question, like why two cats?
Why?
But that makes sense. Two cats, they keep each other company when
Exactly.
there you go. And so I answered my own question.
Yeah.
Well, I know that anyone going out in this climate to listen to this kind of subject, I know it takes maybe it takes more time than usual to even persuade a guest to sit here. So I want to thank the audience for coming. I want to thank you, Mohamad, for joining.
Pleasure.
It's an honor always getting to know you better this way.
Thank you.
And through friendship. But you really are a talented professor. And you're
Thank
able
you.
to do it in a natural setting like this or in a classroom. So I hope you stayed at AUB. And going
Thank
back
you.
to the beginning, I'm glad Dublin is not home anymore. I'm glad
Yeah.
Beirut is home. So the next window of opportunity, I'd like to be here with you.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Thanks to Samir and Rayan. Thanks to Aaliya's. And thanks to everyone. Good night.
Thank you. We did it. Yeah, we did.